On the 9th day of January, 1522, the walls of the Vatican trembled with news that seemed to contemporaries either a bad joke or divine intervention of the harshest kind. The conclave of cardinals, locked in the stuffy rooms, after long debates and mutual blockades, delivered a verdict that made Rome freeze in silent stupor. The new vicar of the throne was announced to be a man whom no one in the city had seen for many decades. His name was Adrian Florenzune Boyens. He was not Italian, he did not belong to the influential Roman clans, and, most strikingly, he was not even present at the election itself, being thousands of kilometers away in politically turbulent Spain. This was a moment when the history of the Catholic Church took a sharp turn, steering the rudder of power into the hands of a man whose character and life principles were in complete, almost painful contradiction to the spirit of the lavish and corrupt Italian Renaissance. Imagine the scene: luxurious halls, accustomed to the aromas of expensive wines and silks, suddenly finding themselves under the rule of an ascetic who was used to the cold air of the Netherlands and the rigor of university departments. In this appointment lay a mystery that, 20 months later, would lead to a tragic end, leaving behind only whispers of poisoning and a sigh of relief from the corrupt elite. To understand how the son of a simple carpenter from Utrecht could rise to the pinnacle of the world hierarchy of that time, one must look at the shadows cast by the era. The late 15th and early 16th centuries were a time of great upheaval and unprecedented brilliance. The Church under the Medici family had transformed into something akin to a secular principality, where the trade in heavenly graces became the foundation for building magnificent cathedrals and paying for the services of the world's best artists. Adrian grew up in a completely different atmosphere. His path began in the modesty and discipline of the northern lands, where he absorbed the ideas of the so-called New Devotion. This movement called for a return to origins, to personal prayer, and a rejection of outward pomp. His brilliant mind and unwavering honesty quickly brought him out of obscurity. He became a professor of theology in Leuven, and then rector of the university. His reputation was so impeccable that Emperor Maximilian I entrusted him with the education of his grandson, the future Emperor Charles V. It was this proximity to the highest secular power, and at the same time, deep devotion to spiritual ideals, that made him a figure of global importance. While Rome was drowning in festivities, Adrian in Spain governed vast territories, facing rebellions and intrigues, all while remaining true to his austere simplicity. When the messenger with the news of his election finally reached Adrian, he perceived it not as a triumph, but as a heavy burden laid upon his shoulders in the darkest hour. The situation in Europe resembled a powder keg. In the north, the monk Martin Luther was already actively igniting the fuses of the Reformation, accusing the papacy of sin and greed. In the east, the Turkish troops of Suleiman the Magnificent were relentlessly advancing deep into the continent, preparing to strike a decisive blow against Christendom. And in Rome itself, the treasury was empty. Debts after the reign of Leo X amounted to hundreds of thousands of ducats, and every corner of the Vatican was permeated with espionage and a thirst for profit. The election of the northern barbarian, as the Italians called him, was the result of the cardinals' desperation, who could not agree among themselves and decided to choose a compromise figure, hoping that a weak and elderly foreigner would be an obedient puppet in their hands. How greatly they erred in their calculations. The external conflict began the moment Adrian's ship docked in the port of Ostia in August 1522. Rome greeted him not with jubilation, but with wary silence and fear of the approaching plague. which had already begun to claim its harvest in the city's narrow streets. Instead of organizing a traditional lavish procession with the distribution of gold, the new pope, who took the name Adrian VI, entered the city almost unnoticed. His first decree was to cut the expenses of the papal court. He dismissed hundreds of freeloaders, jesters, musicians, and numerous servants who had been fed by the church for years. For the Roman aristocracy, accustomed to endless carnivals, this was a declaration of war. The Pope refused golden dishes, preferring simple ceramics, and set a limit of 1 ducat per day for his court's meals. This was not merely an old man's whim. It was a desperate attempt to save the institution of the Church from bankruptcy, both financial and moral. However, political pressure was even more destructive. Charles V, Adrian's former student, expected his mentor to become his loyal ally in the fight against France. But Adrian, true to his conscience, sought to be a father to all Christians, not an instrument in the emperor's hands. He understood that while the great powers of Europe squabbled among themselves over lands in Italy, Rhodes, the key fortress of Christianity in the Mediterranean, was perishing under the onslaught of Ottoman troops. The Pope begged the monarchs to forget their feuds and unite, but his letters remained unanswered. In the eyes of the kings, he was just a strange old man from Utrecht who did not understand the realities of grand politics. Ultimately, Rhodes fell, and the blame for this shameful defeat was unfairly placed on the Pope, whose appeals had been ignored. Adrian VI's internal personal conflict was no less agonizing. Upon arriving at the Vatican, he realized he was in complete isolation. He didn't know enough Italian to understand the subtle hints and double meanings of court intrigues. His Latin was impeccable, but it wasn't spoken in the corridors where the fates of positions and fortunes were decided. Adrian brought with him only a few loyal friends from his homeland, including his secretary, Willem Enkenvoort. This decision caused a storm of indignation. Romans called them Flemish occupiers. The Pope felt that every step he took was sabotaged. His decrees were lost, his letters intercepted, and his private chambers became a place where he couldn't even trust his cook. He was a man of ideas, a scholar accustomed to logic and truth, but he encountered a world where truth was a commodity, and logic served only as a cover for the thirst for power. His loneliness was absolute. He often spent nights in prayer, trying to find an answer to the question, how can a system be reformed that consciously resists any healing? If you were in Adrian VI's shoes at that moment, seeing your noblest intentions met with a wall of hatred and betrayal, what would you do? Would you continue the struggle alone, risking everything? Or would you compromise with those ready to destroy you? Write your opinion in the comments, for the story of Pope Adrian is a classic example of how one person tries to stand against an entire era. The ideological and philosophical conflict of that time lay in the clash of two world models. On one side was the old, medieval ideal of the Church as a spiritual shepherd, striving for holiness. On the other, a new Renaissance concept, where the Church was merely a part of the state apparatus, and the Pope, one of many princes playing geopolitical games. Adrian VI was, perhaps, the last pope who sincerely believed that acknowledging one's own mistakes could stop the Reformation. In 1523, he did something that shocked the entire higher clergy. At the Reichstag in Nuremberg, his envoy read a message in which the Pope openly admitted that the cause of the crisis in the Church was the sins of the clergy themselves and the Vatican elite. He declared that the disease has spread from the head to the members, from the Pope to the prelates. This was an unprecedented admission of guilt. Adrian hoped that such honesty would restore the trust of Protestants and compel Catholics to begin internal purification. But the effect was the opposite. Luther used this admission as proof of the righteousness of his attacks, while Catholic hierarchs perceived it as a betrayal of corporate interests. The Pope found himself an outsider to all. The transformation of the situation occurred in the spring of 1523, when it became clear that Adrian's reforms were not just slowing down, but were being completely blocked by the Curia. The Pope decided to act more decisively. He began investigating the financial machinations of cardinals and restricted revenues from the sale of indulgences, which effectively cut off the cash flow that fueled Rome's luxurious life. In response, the city was filled with satirical poems and pamphlets, which were hung on the statue of Pasquino. The Pope was called the Ass from Utrecht, a miser, and the destroyer of arts. His asceticism was perceived not as a virtue, but as savagery. The contrast was striking. Rome wanted spectacles and gold, but received sermons on repentance and demands to pay taxes. The tension in the air became almost palpable. At the same time, the Pope's health began to deteriorate rapidly. His always robust body, hardened in the northern lands, suddenly began to fail. Constant fatigue, bouts of fever, and stomach pains became his constant companions. The culmination of this drama came in August of 1523. Pope Adrian VI, despite his illness, continued to work, trying to complete at least some of his plans to unite Europe against an external threat. However, in early September, his condition became critical. Rome was rife with rumors. It was said that his illness was not accidental, but the result of a carefully planned conspiracy. In the corridors, whispers circulated about slow-acting poisons that might have been mixed into his meager meals. The official doctors of the time were powerless, and perhaps even part of the system that desired a quick riddance of the inconvenient pontiff. On September 14, 1523, just 1 year, 8 months, and 6 days after his election, the only Dutchman on the papal throne ended his life's journey. Rome's reaction to this event was monstrous in its cynicism. That same night, the door of the Pope's personal physician's house was adorned with garlands of flowers bearing the inscription, "To the Liberator of the Homeland, on behalf of the Senate and the people of Rome." The city celebrated the departure of a man who merely wanted to make the church purer. All his initiatives were immediately curtailed. The next pope was Clement VII of the Medici family, and the Vatican gladly returned to its habitual way of life, festivities, intrigues, and accumulating debts, which ultimately led to the catastrophic sacking of Rome by imperial troops just a few years later. The resonance of Adrian VI's activities only became apparent centuries later. He is often called the misunderstood pope, or a man who came too early. He was the first to realize that without an honest admission of internal problems, the Church could not survive in a changing world. His ideas about the necessity of reforms and the admission of guilt formed the basis of the Council of Trent, which took place much later, and indeed managed to reorganize the Catholic Church, but only after half of Europe was irrevocably lost to Rome. Adrian's story teaches us that even at the very top of power, a person can be infinitely lonely if their values clash with the interests of the system in which they operate. His example shows that honesty in politics is often perceived as weakness, and the pursuit of truth can cost one's life. Today, looking at events 5 centuries ago, we understand that Adrian VI was not an ass from Utrecht, but a visionary whose tragedy lay in his unwavering integrity. To conclude our narrative, It is worth returning to that January day when Adrian's name first resounded over the crowd in St. Peter's Square. At the time, it seemed like the beginning of a new era, a return to apostolic purity. Today, on his tomb in the Church of Santa Maria dell'Anima in Rome, one can read a Latin inscription that serves as a bitter summary of his short reign. Alas, how much it matters in what time even the best of men is called to act. These words are not just an epitaph, they are a warning to all who believe that good intentions alone are enough to change the world. Adrian VI remained in memory as a man who tried to stop the avalanche of history with his bare hands. He died unrecognized, ridiculed, and most likely eliminated by those he called his brothers. But his shadow still roams the corridors of the Vatican, reminding us that the voice of conscience can be heard even where it is least wanted. Reflecting on the fate of this unusual man, we involuntarily ask ourselves, is it even possible to reform a system from within without becoming part of it? Adrian VI tried to remain himself on a throne that demanded him to be someone else. His life and the end of his path are a monumental testament to the clash of idealism with the harsh reality of power. His figure remains a unique paradox. A pope who did not want to be pope, a saint among sinners, a reformer whose death was a celebration for his flock. This story is not just a chronicle of 16th century events. It is an eternal narrative about the search for truth in a world where lies are the foundation of stability. And although his reign lasted less than 2 years, it left an indelible mark, for it showed the limit of human capabilities in the struggle against the current of time. Looking at Sebastiano del Piombo's portrait of Adrian VI, we see not a majestic pontiff, but a tired, deeply thoughtful man with the imprint of immense responsibility on his brow. In his eyes, there is not the gleam of power, but the quiet sadness of one who knows a truth no one wants to hear. His death in September 1523 closed the door to an era of possible reconciliation within Christendom, opening the way to decades of religious wars and schisms. He was the last non-Italian pope for 455 years, until John Paul II ascended the throne in 1978, who also began his reign with a call for openness and dialogue. The cycle of history closed, confirming that Adrian's ideas, though suppressed in his time, proved to be immortal in their essence. Every word in Adrian's message to the German princes, every decision he made to reduce the staff of the papal chancellery, every refusal to participate in dubious alliances, all these were bricks in the foundation of a future he himself never saw. His life ended at a moment of utmost tension, when it seemed all was lost. But it was this failure, this tragic incompatibility of man and place, that made him one of the most poignant figures in human history. He left behind no magnificent palaces or conquered territories. He left something far more important, an example that even in conditions of absolute corruption, one can remain true to one's ideals, even if the price of that fidelity proves exorbitantly high. In the quiet of the Santa Maria dell'Anima church, far from the bustle of tourist routes, rests a man who wanted to save Rome from itself. His story reminds us that true greatness is not always measured by successes recognized by contemporaries. Sometimes it lies in the very act of resistance, in the willingness to stand against all for what one believes is right. Adrian VI, the Pope from Utrecht, remains an eternal reminder that even the darkest night of history cannot completely swallow the light of the human soul, striving for justice and purification. His path was short, but it illuminated those depths of institutional crisis that the Church had tried to ignore for centuries. And in this lies his main victory, achieved at the cost of his own life's end in solitude and suspicion. When we analyze the mechanisms of power and how they grind down destinies, the story of Adrian VI emerges as a vivid warning. It teaches us to pay attention to details, to how financial interests can masquerade as religious fervor, and how easily the crowd swaps its idols for those who promise familiar comfort instead of difficult change. Adrian offered no easy paths. He offered the path of bitter medicine, which was necessary to save the organism. The fact that the patient chose to eliminate the doctor instead of taking the treatment is not the doctor's fault, but the tragedy of the patient, the consequences of which were felt for a very long time. This story makes one ponder the nature of leadership. Should a leader be part of the environment to successfully manage it? Or is a true leader always an outsider, capable of seeing the system from afar and pointing out its flaws? Adrian was precisely such an outsider. His otherness was his strength, but it also became his sentence. He brought the cold, clear light of the northern intellect into the sultry, oversaturated atmosphere of Rome, and this light blinded those accustomed to living in the twilight of intrigues. We often look for great victors in history, triumphant figures whose names are carved on arches. But the story of Adrian VI is the story of a great defeat, which, in its significance, surpasses many victories. It is a testament that the moral compass can point the right direction even when all other navigation tools have failed. And though his reign ended in September of 1523, the questions he posed to his contemporaries remain relevant even in 2026. How to maintain humanity within power structures, how to implement reforms without destroying foundations, and what is the price of honesty in a world where everything has its price? Everyone finds the answers to these questions for themselves, turning the pages of the past. But one thing remains constant: the name of Adrian VI, the only Dutchman on the Holy See, will always be associated with the courage to be oneself against all odds. His brief flight above the abyss of papal politics left a bright trail by which one can study the anatomy of power and the limits of the human spirit. And perhaps today more than ever, it is important for us to remember this modest professor from Utrecht, who was not afraid to speak the truth to the most powerful organization of his time, knowing what would follow. Concluding this narrative, we once again see shadows on the walls of the Vatican, hear the whispers of cardinals, and feel the weight of the golden fisherman's ring on the hand of a man who would have preferred to hold a simple book in it. The story of Adrian VI is an endless reminder that time always puts everything in its place, and what seemed like a defeat in the 16th century acquires the features of a spiritual feat in the eyes of descendants. He left to remain, becoming a symbol that even the most closed system is not immune to the emergence within it of a voice of conscience, capable of changing everything, if not immediately, then in the long-term perspective of historical justice.